I'm Rebecca Grant. I'm a journalist who covers reproductive rights, health, and justice, and I'm also the author of two books. The first, Birth, Three Mothers, 9 Months of Pregnancy in America, came out in 2023, and my most recent book, Access Inside the Abortion Underground and the 60-Year Battle for Reproductive Freedom, published in June 2025.
Yes, and thank you for joining us for the second book because we talked about birth a couple of years ago now. It's pretty amazing. So I'd like you to begin by telling us kind of the same question I asked the first time, which is how did you get to this topic and how did you come to approach it the way you did? You use archival history, oral narrative, and contemporary field work. How did you frame the book as you were putting it together?
I've been on the beat, kind of the repro beat, the abortion beat for about almost exactly 10 years. I think the first abortion story that I did might have published in October of 2015, if I'm remembering correctly. So it's been a full decade. And I think I always knew I wanted to write a book about abortion. I didn't, earlier years ago, maybe didn't know the exact approach, angle, scope, scale, or anything. But I felt like I had an abortion book in me. And then in April of 2022, I had an assignment from New York Magazine where, in the lead up to the Dobbs decision, in which, I think a lot of folks anticipated that Roe was going to be overturned. Certainly, there were many people who it was, a big surprise for, but I think a lot of people were at that point, even before the Alito leak, were really anticipating what was going to happen. And so I had an assignment from New York Magazine that was looking at how and where will people be able to find abortion pills in the event that Roe versus Wade is overturned. And I think I was particularly well positioned to get that assignment, to report that story, because through my many years on the beat, I had done a lot of reporting both on grassroots activism in the abortion landscape, and I had done international reporting. And medication abortion, abortion pills had played this major role in international abortion activism for years before that really happened in the US. So I was well positioned to pursue that story. And one of the questions that my editor had was, are you going to be able to find someone who is planning to distribute abortion pills kind of underground unofficially? Because we would love to hear from them. And frankly, I did not know if I would be able to find someone, or I thought maybe I would be able to find someone, but they wouldn't be willing to talk to me on the record, albeit anonymously. But I tried, I reached out, worked my sources, and I did find someone who was willing to talk with me. And I remember it very clearly because this source, who I call Stephanie in the book, she messaged me on Signal while it was the day of my sister-in-law's wedding. And so I was on this beautiful property outside of Austin, Texas, and it was very DIY. So I had been making flower garlands all day and was making a cheese board. So I was just a total mess. And the source messaged me, and I, ran into the house to try to find a quiet corner. And we did that interview, which became a This American Life piece in 2022. And that source had mentioned that they were planning to get pills from Mexico, from an organization called Los Libres that was based in Mexico. And they had also reached out to Dr. Rebecca Gompertz, who's a Dutch doctor who had founded a number of global abortion organizations. And so that was kind of this connection to me of, oh, here's this American activist. We don't even know what's going to happen with Dobbs, but she's preparing to resurrect an American abortion underground. And she's relying on these international activists for help with infrastructure, logistics, ideas, security. I mean, just all of that, leaning on these international activists. So that was really interesting to me. And I really did see it as this resurrection of an underground. And so that led me to ask all of these questions of, in the years before Roe, what did the underground look like? And then how is it going to be looking today, kind of post-Roe, but with all of this new technology? And so I know that was kind of a long-winded answer, but obviously the scope of the book is really, really huge. And I think it was just because I had this kernel, this question of what will the underground look like in post-Dobbs America? And it led me in all these really interesting directions, around the world, across generations. And a book is such a great format to be able to follow lots of different threads wherever they will take you.
Yeah, and I want to return to the pill distribution and telehealth and all that in a minute, but I want to kind of pick at something you said about the tying it to the origins and kind of the underground prior to legalization in Roe in America. And one of the things that I was struck by is the groups like the Jane Collective or the list. These
Mhm.
people were using telephones and call centers and referrals and things like this at a time when um, like I guess it's kind of hokey to think of today, but at the time it was very powerful and impactful and really connected people to providers and things like that. So could you maybe take the Janes, whichever one you want to work with, and just kind of explain how that organization functioned prior to legalization in the States?
And we could talk about this later too, or after I answer the first part of that question. But one of the things that I found the most fascinating and maybe even surprising was all of the similarities that I saw, that I found, that I identified between the activists in the 60s into the early 70s and the activists today. Because as I said before, the technology looks so different in so many different ways. And abortion pills, medication abortion is sort of this, revolutionary game changer. But there were all of these similarities. And I think one of the core ones, which might sound obvious, but it's not, I think is sort of this network-based system that these were really, for the most part, lay people. I mean, some of them were doctors or nurses. There was a robust networks of clergy who were involved. But I mean, really, it was these networks that people kind of spread through word of mouth. And I really focused on feminist underground abortion networks because back then, kind of in the years before Roe, we know all these terms like back alley doctors, right? Or back alley abortion. So there were people both who were doctors, who were not doctors, who pretended to be, who provided illegal abortions in secret with varying degrees of safety and hygiene. And so there were some super, unethical, dangerous, unscrupulous providers. But there were also some legitimate, medical providers who did provide safe care. And those, of course, were more expensive, but there was this whole gamut, right? And so one of the things that was dangerous for women who were seeking abortions is that they didn't really know what they were going to get, right? And there were all these stories of women being robbed, abused, sexually assaulted during the procedures, or just being treated really poorly, or becoming, gravely ill. Like complications from unsafe abortions were so prevalent at the time that most hospitals with OB wards had or most hospitals had dedicated wards called infected OB because so many people were coming in. So what a lot of the starting point for many different underground abortion networks, kind of both explicitly feminist ones and others, was how do we make this safer? This is an unregulated, kind of unaccountable kind of black market situation, and it can be really dangerous, but it doesn't have to be if we provide in these measures of oversight and accountability and we help people figure out what the safe places to go are. And so at the most fundamental level, I think kind of the three feminist activist groups that I really focus on in the first couple chapters, a group based out of the San Francisco Bay Area that created the list, which was like a vetted catalog of abortion providers. And so initially they were handing out 10, and it wasn't only in the US, there's a number of providers in Mexico or Sweden or Japan, but over time through word of mouth, it grew. And so women could call or write in to this organization. They were called the Society for Humane Abortion, and they could receive this list and then they could decide where to go. And over time, it grew to have dozens of providers who were involved, and the list actively, the activists who were there, they would do surprise visits. They would get feedback from the women that they sent there, so that if a provider did something shady, it would get back to the list and they would remove that provider from the catalog. There might be tips around like, this provider like does speak English, even if they might not seem to, if it was a provider in a foreign country. It's like something like that. And so that kind of referral network model was really powerful. And that was really how the Jane Collective, that was based in Chicago, really how they started, was as a referral network. There was a feminist who heard from someone who needed an abortion. They asked around, they found a doctor. But over time, they ended up working the most closely with one particular provider who they thought was a doctor. It turned out that he wasn't. He was just a regular guy who had been taught how to provide, high quality abortion care. And so that gave the Janes the thought, well, if this random dude can learn how to do it, why couldn't we? And so a core inner circle of the of these women, of the Janes, taught themselves how to provide abortion care. And so that was really an example of kind of lay women taking that responsibility, taking it into their own hands. And I also think touches on some of the themes that we had talked about with my first book, Birth, around kind of how medical care and specifically reproductive health care, obstetrics and gynecology for, a long period of time, kind of around mid-century America, was kind of entirely in the hands of men. And so during this kind of second wave feminist movement, a lot of women started to be really interested in like, how do we get this knowledge and these skills and practice it amongst ourselves? And so then for the third group that I focus kind of closely on, who are known as the West Coast Sisters, they similarly started out as a referral network, but they were working closely with one provider in particular in Santa Monica in Los Angeles. And he had helped develop this new device that used suction to empty the uterus as opposed to dilation and curettage, which is kind of more about like, I guess, scraping with a curette. And so the device was intentionally meant to be easier and have a lower risk of complication, which lended itself to lay people using it. And so that group of feminists, their network, their idea was really around teaching groups of women to practice with this device amongst each other. They had this idea called self-help. And so while the Janes taught themselves to be providers, it was still kind of like this provider-patient relationship. And the West Coast Sisters were really trying to make that more horizontal, to kind of have everyone be a peer. And so I think that there was like these particular spins that the activist groups took. And interestingly, in some cases, there were disagreements or tensions between them. Like the West Coast Sisters and the Janes actually met at one point, and they were each kind of a little bit horrified by what the other was doing. And so I think, just a lot of those dynamics and some of those differences and some of the differences in philosophy as well. Those were a lot of the things that I ended up seeing as being very present in the modern day underground as it has evolved.
Yeah, one thing I noticed too when we talk about these 60s, 70s activist groups, they were quite radical in a couple ways. And one of them is not only were they putting themselves in legitimate danger of legal arrest and jail, but they were also fighting a patriarchal system of male doctors who were providing abortion care, I guess. Can you kind of tell us how that worked differently in these female-led groups versus kind of the back alley abortionist or the male doctor who would do it kind of on the side? Because I think there are some real innovations that we see after Roe picked up and expanded.
Mm-hmm. I mean, certainly, there were some male providers who were really important and effective allies, or they would go on to train the women. But I think kind of an interesting example of I think what you're talking about is how, so during the early 70s, a handful of states had started to legalize abortion. And so even, before Roe, there were some states where people could go to access legal abortion. And when that happened, New York is an example, the Janes started sending some of the women who came their way, the ones who were able or willing to travel, to seek legal care. Washington, D.C. was another place where people could go. Because depending on how, when they were still kind of more rooted in the referral system, underground abortions, especially with a quality provider, were expensive. And so in some cases, it was actually cheaper for people to travel to New York or Washington, D.C. from Chicago and access care at a legal clinic, as opposed to going to the underground provider in Chicago. But there were a couple of patients who went to New York and they visited these kind of facilities, really kind of proto-abortion clinics, or I guess really they were some of the first abortion clinics that had emerged. And they received this legal care from predominantly male doctors. And they actually preferred care that they had received or accessed at the Janes because it felt so different. The Janes tended to be operating out of apartments, sometimes hotel rooms. But as the organization evolved, they rented dedicated apartments. So they had bedrooms that had, kind of cute bohemian sheets. The women would often be like maybe cooking something for lunch. Like the vibe was so different. It was much less clinical, and it was much kind of softer and more compassionate in many cases. And there was a discussion about, feminism could kind of be part of the discussion. And so it really wasn't meant to feel like a medical experience. And that, of course, when someone went to a medical facility to have an abortion, really was what it felt like. And even with the self-helpers, like I was talking about, I mean, their idea was that this is self-help, like we're allowed to kind of take care of our own bodies. And they saw this knowledge as being really empowering. And this was around the time that that book, Our Body, Ourselves, came out. And so there was this real idea that men shouldn't be the keepers of this information and this knowledge, or the only ones, because it puts kind of women in this defensive, subservient position where they're really disconnected. And so I think that there was a lot of thinking about, as legalization, after Roe happened, of what will the legal abortion system look like. And so particularly perhaps among the West Coast sisters, they were really worried or at least concerned about their practice, which they referred to as menstrual extraction, being co-opted by the male medical establishment. And they got really annoyed, if like a doctor referred to what he was doing as menstrual extraction, they got annoyed because they were like, no, this is an explicitly feminist practice. And after Roe, one of the founders of that group, or the founder of the group, founded what became the Federation of Feminist Women's Health Clinics. And so there was this real effort, once abortion became, a constitutionally protected right, to maintain, I think, some of that spirit of this doesn't kind of have to look like just like any other medical care. But I also think that can be something that's really difficult to maintain, especially if there's high volume and there are, of course, certain kind of clinical standards that have to be met in regulation. And so I think it's always a bit, and I think it never really has stopped being that kind of a bit of a push-pull, because yes, abortion is healthcare and it's a medical procedure, but it's also so much more than that. And it doesn't have to be a medical procedure. Like, you could think about it differently. So I think that the feminists then, and certainly over the years, and absolutely now with the underground that we have, they've played this role of kind of pushing thinking and knowledge about abortion and how to approach it forward. I mean, in many cases, some of the really radical activists who I think Dr. Gompertz is a really good version of this, which we could talk more about her, but she started practicing telemedicine abortion back in 2005, 2006, before really telemedicine at all was a thing. And people thought she was nuts, but she really saw that, for a lot of women, being able to send them pills in the mail and have them take it at home offers this convenience and this privacy and this discretion and this control that, aside from maybe not being able to access abortion in the country where they live or the place where they live, for some people, this is a better fit. And I think a lot of people in the US in particular were like, no, like, we need all of this medical oversight and all of this testing for this to be safe. And there's so much research that's shown that's not true. So I think Dr. Gompertz did something quite similar to what those pre-Roe activists did, which is that they showed a different way. They kind of created the version of abortion care that they thought should exist. And then really the rest of the world in some ways caught up.
Yeah, and we'll get a little bit deeper into that in a minute, but I want to talk about post-Roe. So Roe is passed, the landscape radically changes all of a sudden. And now we have, and because I think you make an argument, I don't know if it's intentional or not, but that there was almost a complacency that set in, that this is now the law. Now we just have to figure out how to maintain and establish kind of clinic-based abortions. So Planned Parenthood and the other groups you've mentioned begin to kind of hunker down and become professionalized, come out of the shadows, as it were. And can you explain how that was good and bad at the same time, and how it kind of led to this challenge from the anti-choice crowd that ultimately takes hold and wins the day?
Achieving constitutional protection, federal protections for abortions back in 1973 was a milestone achievement. It was a huge achievement. It was a sign of, years and years of activism and fighting. And because at the time, unsafe abortion and illegal abortion were essentially synonymous, I mean, this was a law, this was a decision that was going to lead to laws that were very much going to save lives. And so I think that, those legal protections really mattered. But almost as soon as Roe versus Wade was decided, there were efforts to restrict it, efforts to overturn it, efforts to undermine it. I mean, those really started just right immediately after. And there certainly have been kind of ebbs and flows over the years as political and cultural winds have shifted. And, one of the first kind of major threats or attacks was on abortion access for poor women who were on Medicaid. And so that's always kind of like the orchestrator of that policy, Henry Hyde, said that it was low hanging fruit. Like he was really open about that his larger goal was to restrict abortion, but the main thing he had control over was abortion for poor women. Also throughout really the 80s and 90s, there was a huge amount of violence, of clinic-based violence, murders of providers and arsons and bomb threats and all of that. So I think for all of those reasons, so much of the reproductive rights movement, and that's what it was referred to, right? The rights movement was really focused on protecting abortion access through policy, through laws, with politics and the courts and court decisions. And I think that absolutely, I talk about a sense of complacency, but I also think it was a little bit of kind of just being really, really focused on this is the arena that the fight's in. And in many ways, the abortion fund movement emerged in response to that, which I kind of briefly go into in the book, which is that there was this recognition that rights did not translate to access. Sure, you can fight to protect abortion access in a particular state or overturn a restriction or prevent one from getting passed, but that doesn't mean that everybody who lives there is able to access abortion, whether it's because it's too expensive, whether it's because there isn't a clinic anywhere near them and they can't travel to it. I mean, there's so many reasons. And so right does not guarantee access. And I think that is really where that complacency that you mentioned, which was absolutely my intention to kind of highlight, I think that's really where we saw it come in, because I think that there were, the people who were focused on the important fight that needed to be happening in politics and the courts, but that meant that there wasn't as much focus on all the people who were still and already being left behind. And that when there were activists who were really trying to expand access to say, we need to fight against the Hyde Amendment, we need to fight for no gestational limits, because we know that people who are throughout pregnancy need abortions for all kinds of reasons. And then there was this worry amongst the kind of establishment, the institutionalists, that was going to backfire, that then the movement would be referred to as too radical, or that, if you ask for too much, like that could have these risks. And so there was just like a lot of kind of conservatism, like, lowercase c, and caution. And of course, like, it's understandable why that was true, but it just left a lot of people, particularly marginalized people, being really left behind. And it led to this disconnect between the reality on paper and the reality on the ground. And so something that I found really interesting was that the abortion fund that I really closely talk about in the book, which is the T Fund based in North Texas, Texas Equal Access Fund, but I also have talked with plenty of others. And especially for those who are working in states like Texas or Mississippi or Louisiana, Dobbs absolutely changed the landscape, and it was a catastrophe. I'm not trying to say that it wasn't, but in some ways it didn't change the landscape as much for people in the banned states as maybe it did elsewhere, because they were already operating in a context in which they were hearing from people every day who couldn't access abortion where they lived. And I think that is really what the reproductive justice movement has been trying to talk about for decades, but kind of, I think there's been more mainstream awareness of it, which is that you can't sell out certain segments of the population to protect this kind of abstract right. The fight can only happen in these avenues of power. It also has to be happening on the ground. And I think that in some ways, the Dobbs decision was a real wake-up call on that, because the strategy that went all in on politics in the courts clearly failed. And so it was just like there was this loss in faith in institutions. There was this idea that, like, no politician or judge is coming to save us, so we have to save ourselves. And what does that look like on a grassroots level? And I think it looks like a lot of different things, but I think there's been this paradigm shift away from a rights-based framework and more towards an access-based one. And that's really been helped along by medication abortion, because one of the radical things about abortion pills is that it means that illegal and safety, or legality rather, and safety aren't necessarily one and the same.
Yeah, and that's an important point. And I think as we move forward, that's probably going to be more and more driven home as access points for underground care.
Mm-hmm.
Could you, because as Roe is passed and abortion is legalized in America, I know I didn't pay much attention to the abortion issue in other countries. And
Mm.
one of the ones that surprised me was this give and take between the US and Mexico. And somehow that relationship develops over time and changes. But then there's also, you mentioned Dr. Gompertz, I think.
Mhm.
And could you talk briefly about her novel idea of taking boats into international water and providing care to countries like Poland and Ireland?
I first learned about Dr. Gompertz right around the time that I started on this beat. And so I feel like there's this way in which like being exposed to her thinking so early on in the beat has really informed my own kind of over the course of the career. So in 2014, this documentary called Vessel came out. It's a really good documentary. It's by a filmmaker named Diana Whitten, and it documented Rebecca Gompertz's work. And that was how I first learned about her, which was that I reported a story about this sort of feminist activist group movement called Shout Your Abortion. One of the organizations hosted a screening. I learned about Dr. Gompertz, and then I did a story, I think the following year, about the 10-year anniversary of Women on Web. So that's just to say that I was exposed to her very early in my career. And as you said, she had initially been a physician on a Greenpeace ship protesting environmental degradation. And she learned a lot about maritime law and kind of how that works. And she had this idea of what if you could do something similar with abortion? So I believe it was 1999, she incorporated an organization called Women on Waves. And the idea was, as you said, that you would sail a boat to a country with an abortion ban, and then in international waters where the laws of the country that the boat is flagged to apply rather than the country it might be closest to, you could provide medication abortions at sea. And so because Dr. Gompertz was Dutch and she had boats that were flagged to the Netherlands, that meant that if you went to a country like Ireland or like Poland, you sailed out to international waters, which is usually about 12 nautical miles offshore, that then the laws of the Netherlands would apply. And so in addition to being kind of an audacious scheme to provide abortion care, it was also clearly meant to be this big kind of dramatic media attention. It was meant to stimulate conversation. It was meant to attract attention, just as many of the Greenpeace campaigns were. So the first campaign in 2001 was to Ireland. Due to some kind of licensing issues, they weren't able to provide abortions during that trip. But the second foray in 2003 to Poland, they did. And the ships managed to provide medication abortions to over a dozen Polish women. So they sailed to Poland, they docked, women went on board. They took a number of steps to make sure that their identities were protected, sailed out to sea, did abortion care, sailed back to Poland. And then they did a number of additional kind of trips over the years: Portugal, Spain, Morocco, Ecuador, and they weren't always successful. In the case of Portugal, the Portuguese Navy was marshaled to try to stop them from entering the territorial waters. And so because the ship couldn't dock, Dr. Gompertz went on a local talk show, and she basically explained how people could go to their local pharmacy and buy a medication called, I think in Portugal, it was called Cytotec or Arthrotec, which are, different brand names, but for this drug called misoprostol, which is an ulcer medication. And they could just go to any pharmacy and buy it. And then there was a specific protocol that they could use to self-induce an abortion safely and effectively. So when I say medication abortion, maybe I should have said this earlier, but there's two drugs. There's mifepristone and misoprostol, which is what we usually think about, that are used together. But misoprostol on its own can also be used to end a pregnancy. And so that kind of seeded this new form of activism for Dr. Gompertz, where she realized that with the right information and the right resources, people could access abortion kind of where they lived. And so while the boat campaigns were really effective and powerful from a media standpoint, they weren't really that scalable. They took a huge amount of planning. They didn't know if they were successful. There was only many women they could take out. And so those kinds of realizations are what led her in 2006 to found Women on Web, which, as I said before, was the first global telemedicine service. And then in a 2008 campaign to Ecuador, when their boat was caught in a storm, the kind of local Ecuador activists and women on waves ended up creating a safe abortion hotline where they shared the number, and then people called and received that information over the phone. And that kind of helped seed safe abortion hotlines all over Latin America. So sort of similar to what I was talking about with the pre-Roe activists, there was just all of these different kind of original ways that people could use the technology of medication abortion, and, of course, of phones, but then also later of the internet as well, to provide access to the pills and to kind of really push boundaries forward. And so in 2018, Dr. Gompertz had never worked in the US before. She had never served the US. But in 2018, kind of not that long after the first time that President Trump was elected, she was receiving so many calls from people in the US, and she decided to start a US arm of Women on Web, which she called Aid Access. And Aid Access is this major kind of huge player and has continued to be so in making telemedicine abortion available to people in all 50 states, even after the Dobbs decision. So, while she's an international figure and, she's not American, the role that she has played in kind of the US abortion landscape is really quite significant.
Yeah, and let's get into the kind of telehealth, how these pills start to spread, because the networking mirrors AIDS medication, right? And it comes out of the kind of the AIDS epidemic and the resistance, especially during the Reagan years, to make the medication and some of these cocktails that developed affordable and accessible to people with HIV. So could you explain that lineage and then where these pills come from? Because I was really surprised to find out about the network and kind of the international connection to it all.
That was so fascinating to me. And there was a lot of things I loved about reporting this book, but that was one of maybe kind of the unexpected ones. So Dr. Gompertz, back in the early 2000s, when she was setting up Women on Web, to create this global telemedicine service, one thing that was really important to her was that it would be legal. And so there wasn't one country in the world at the time, or maybe even now, where you could set up every part of it legally. But she realized that if she incorporated the organization in Canada, if she was the prescribing physician, or if there was a prescribing physician, which ended up being her in Austria, so she got her Austrian medical license. And then if the pills were sent from India, that the function happening in each of those places was legal in those places. And so when she was looking to, and she figured this out, on consultation with some very excellent lawyers who kind of helped her figure all of these details out. It involved a lot of legal research. Excuse me. And so when she was figuring all of this out, there were a small group, maybe really just two, India and China, where she was considering sourcing the medication from. And both of those countries have big pharmaceutical industries, and they produce a lot of generic medications and active ingredients, certainly in the case of China. And so they were kind of natural places for her to go look, because she was looking for affordable bulk supply sources where local pharmacies or kind of pharmaceutical exporters would be able to send those medications to other countries. And India was certainly one of those countries. And so she ended up partnering really closely with a number of kind of pharmaceutical entrepreneurs in India who then dispatched the medication. So when the American underground activists were starting to look about where they wanted to source the medication, as I said before, they initially were reaching out to Vero Cruz, who is the founder of Los Libres, and in some cases to Dr. Gompertz. But shortly after the Dobbs decision, a number of blue states in the US started passing what are known as shield laws, telehealth shield laws, which basically mean that providers, clinical licensed providers in these blue states, they're meant to protect those physicians or nurses or midwives if they prescribe medication abortion to a patient in Texas. So a doctor in New York, for instance, could prescribe to a patient in Texas, and New York will protect that physician. With that shift, which Aid Access was kind of they immediately had doctors on board who were willing to practice and created this network of shield law providers. Those physicians in the US were shipping medication that like FDA approved official kind of medication, right? So I feel like I'm jumping around a little bit because it's a bit complicated, but hopefully you're still with me. So um, Aid Access stopped kind of working with the India prescribers, and they were working with the US approved FDA medication because telehealth, telemedicine is distinct from self-managed abortion. It might kind of seem the same because it's, mail order and you're taking it at home, but telehealth, there's, doctor oversight. In the case of Aid Access, it's, FDA approved medication. What the activists, like the one like Stephanie that I mentioned before, were doing, who are operating underground, they don't have access to FDA approved medication. So they had to find a source. They had to find a place to go. Initially, Vero Cruz of Los Libres was giving them medication for free because she receives a lot of supplies from donations from international NGOs. But once the American need became so big, she was no longer able to just kind of keep entirely providing that supply. And so she ended up helping some of the American activists, including Stephanie, connect with international figures who were basically directly involved in the Indian pharmaceutical industry and who were able to sell them bulk pills at an extremely affordable price and who didn't really need to worry about like the US laws because they weren't shipping them directly to the US, if that makes sense. So I was really curious. I found out that all of these underground sources of mine were sourcing their medication from India. And I was curious why. Like I wanted to know, well, why India? Kind of why is this the thing? I learned that India is the largest exporter or manufacturer of generic pharmaceuticals by volume. So it has a huge generic pharmaceutical industry. And so once I started to look more into that and to try to understand kind of like how and why that came to be, I went down this whole rabbit hole about the Indian pharmaceutical industry. And then to mention the HIV and AIDS parallels that you mentioned before, there, back in the 80s, there had been all of this reluctance, I guess, on behalf of the Reagan administration to treat HIV and AIDS like the epidemic that it was, to really invest heavily in scientific research and trying to figure out treatment. And so that meant that activists who and patients who were dealing with this kind of, stigmatized disease or type of medical care, they felt like they had to figure out their treatment options on their own. And so they did, a lot of their own research. And then they also went on these buying trips and created these organizations called buyers clubs to source kind of experimental medications outside of the US and then build this body of knowledge and share it amongst each other. And so the character that's kind of memorialized in that movie, Dallas Buyers Club, he often went back and forth to Mexico and traveled to India because in India, people could get drugs really affordably. They had this big pharmaceutical industry, in part just to meet their own kind of domestic public health needs because it was a big country with a lot of public health needs. And so, that activism of kind of we're taking the stigmatized form of healthcare into our own care. We're not waiting for the US government to figure this out or to give us permission. We're taking it into our own hands. That was this really direct legacy that I saw to abortion activism. And there were a whole bunch of like World Trade Organization rules around generic pharmaceuticals. But as the AIDS kind of was spreading really rapidly around the world and treatment was really necessary, especially in places like in sub-Saharan Africa where there, people couldn't afford to spend tens of thousands of dollars a year on AIDS treatments. There became this real interest in sourcing low cost, super affordable generic pharmaceuticals. And so a lot of the AIDS medications that were then shipped to, countries in sub-Saharan Africa were from India. And so I know that was pretty long-winded. That's sort of like the shortest I could feel like to make it, but there was just like this long history of Indian generic pharmaceutical products kind of helping to fill these gaps in not just American healthcare, but all over the world. And so as part of the reporting process, I actually got a grant, a journalism grant, and I went to India and I met with a bunch of the suppliers, the middlemen, manufacturers, like all of the kind of Indian people who were on the supply side of the supply chain, really, just to understand more how it all worked. And I mean, there was a number of things that were really fascinating about that. One is that for most of them, they're like business people. So it's not that they don't support the cause or that they don't care about the cause or think it's important, but they're kind of just like we're making a product, you want the product, like it's not that big of a deal to them in the same way. I don't know, in the US, abortion is sort of so like freighted and polarized and feels like such a controversial thing. And most of them were just like, I don't know, it doesn't feel like that big of a deal. Um, it's a business opportunity. But the other thing that I learned is that the medication that US activists are obtaining from these Indian sources and smuggling back into the US essentially is often from the same manufacturers who are supplying these international, or the same suppliers who are selling to international family planning NGOs. So like the medication is legitimate, the medication is safe, right? Because that's of course a concern of if you're getting abortion pills off of like a gray market, that could seem really, really sketchy. And it's not to say that there are no concerns around the lack of accountability or oversight or making sure medication is packaged properly, not expired. Like absolutely all of that is true. But really, the medication is what it says it is, and it works the way that it's supposed to work. And there are organizations in the US like Plan C who are providing that measure of accountability and oversight where they'll obtain medication from the underground networks, the community support networks as they're called, or they'll buy them from just some of like the e-commerce vendors who have websites that are, like abortionpillsrx.com or something, and they'll test them. They'll get them chemically tested. And for the most, if the medication is what it says it is, the listings will stay up on Plan C. If it's not, they would get removed in this way that functions kind of similar to how the list did back in the 60s. So that was one of those other kind of interesting connections that I saw.
Yeah, and you touched on it, but there's a whole network now developing of people who are as young as high schoolers and as old as grandparents who are supplying these pills to anyone who asks for them at either very low cost or no cost.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that the same thing is happening with, or is beginning to start to happen with trans medication.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting that the networks are learning from each other. Could you just kind of give us a brief overview of how that underground works today? So if I wanted to get an abortion, how would I go about contacting one of these groups?
Yeah. So the information kind of is out there on a number of websites, of locations. There's a really excellent subreddit, the kind of subreddit / abortion. Like they have an amazing team there who provides information. So certainly what I'm about to say isn't the only place to get the information, but the organization that I mentioned called Plan C, they were founded, kind of the earliest stages of them were back, kind of 2015, 2016, by a group of public health researchers who worked internationally. So they knew how easy medication abortion was to get abroad. And they were like, it's crazy that you can't get it this easily in the US. It's under all these FDA regulations. And one thing sort of led to another, but Plan C now has a website where they, based on the state that you live, they will share the options, like what options exist for people to access medication abortion in that state. And they include a whole range of listings. And so they include telehealth providers like Aid Access. So there's a bunch of other telehealth providers who exist now. So those are, like I said, the US clinicians operating under shield laws. They also include those e-commerce vendors who are just kind of entrepreneurs who sell medication abortion in addition to often other things. Like sometimes those websites, they only sell medication abortion, and sometimes they might like also sell, I don't know, Viagra or like some other kind of thing. And then the third category are these kind of underground networks that refer to themselves as community support networks. And so these are these feminist activists who provide medication abortion for free. And so on Plan C, it's a pretty decentralized network. And so on Plan C, the option will vary depending on the state that you're in. But if you're in and you can do it for, all 50 states, not just in states that have banned abortion. But let's say you're in Ohio, I guess, in this case, if you go to Plan C and you say that you're in Ohio, there will be a whole spectrum of options and you can kind of go through and evaluate that lets you know what's available. But in the case of someone who's accessing a community support network, You send, usually it's a message to an encrypted email address, or you fill out a kind of an encrypted form with information. They're going to ask some questions around, usually around like gestational age, or if you have any contraindications that might mean you're not eligible to safely take the medication. But assuming that you are eligible to take the medication, they will send you a package in the mail with a complete regimen of mifepristone and misoprostol with a complete medication abortion. And you can manage that abortion at home or wherever kind of feels safe to you. And the kind of activists on the other side, they might answer some questions. They might refer you to someone else to answer questions. Because it's so decentralized, it can vary a little bit kind of from place to place, but there's all sorts of resources. The miscarriage and abortion hotline, which is staffed by clinicians to answer questions. There's resources for emotional support. But really kind of on the back end of these networks, which I did this deep dive to, you have the folks who are getting a supply from abroad. So usually that looks like traveling abroad and carrying some supply back. They have some strategies for kind of receiving stuff in the mail. And then there are individual mailers all over the country who will kind of get maybe, let's say, a cache of like 100 doses of medication abortion or something. And so when an order comes through, when a request comes through from someone who says, I need these pills, they will then be the ones who are individually packaging it and putting it in the mail. And, these networks have lots of security protocols and mailing protocols. I mean, they're really, really careful, both for their own privacy and security and for that of the people that they're serving. And, it's not, especially like for the people who are self-managing their abortions at home, like it's not completely risk-free in terms of the law. I mean, we know it's super safe and effective. There have been cases of people who have gotten on the radar of law enforcement for self-managing their abortion, but actually most states don't have explicit laws against self-managed abortion. And so it's always good to be careful and discreet and to practice digital security things, right? Not talking about stuff like this on just like regular messaging apps, using an app like Signal, which is encrypted. Using a VPN can be a great way to protect yourself. So, the Digital Defense Fund has a lot of good resources like that, and I talk about them in the book. So, it's not like, this isn't to say that it's super, super straightforward, but ultimately the networks have created such a situation that you could be in any state, figure out who kind of the distributor is through a website like Plan C, send a request, and then a couple days later, receive medication abortion in the mail for free. And that's pretty remarkable. And like they're serving, thousands of patients a month. I think community support networks alone have been seeing around 5,000 or helping around 5,000. Aid Access, I think the most recent numbers I saw, they're maybe seeing 8,000 people. So, abortions have gone up since Dobbs, and that's not including self-managed abortion, which is the thing I think a lot of people don't realize. So these networks are have really stepped up and risen to the occasion to ensure that people have options wherever they are.
All right, now here's the final unfair question. Look into your crystal orb of the future and predict the next 5-10 years. What are we looking at?
I don't know if this is a cop-out, but I'm going to say that when I think of what the future holds, what most interests me is not necessarily the laws or what the Supreme Court does, which is not to say that that doesn't matter. Of course it matters. People should be able to go to a legal brick and mortar facility wherever they live. Abortion pills and self-managed abortion is not a good fit for everyone by any means. So, I'm not saying that the laws and the courts and all of that doesn't matter. But I think that focusing so much on these grassroots networks and seeing how they have evolved and grown and adapted, I think that we're just going to see more and more of that. And I think that in the beginning, or even just a couple years ago, a lot of the mainstream organizations were really reluctant and wary to engage with any of these organizations at all, whether it was Plan C or community support networks, or whether it was even sharing information about self-managed abortion on their websites. And now even that has started to change. And so I think that kind of the movement, I guess, and the grassroots are going to continue to not only play an important role, but I think become even more central and salient in the landscape. And that's not to say that there won't be really aggressive efforts to stop them. And they're all facing funding crunches. Like almost every abortion fund, certainly the community support networks, like funding is really, really challenging because donors are worried about legal culpability. But, you know, like some of the legal attacks that people are really concerned about right now, like there's been all years worth of efforts to try to get the approval of mifepristone by the FDA kind of rescinded or rolled back in some way. And so if something like that happens, like, you know, if the FDA does a review and they decide that mifepristone, you know, isn't safe, which we know it is, or that it shouldn't be mailed or something, the primary way to get it will be through underground groups. And so if you think about that, like the gold standard of what's considered kind of the gold standard of medication abortion, if like depending on what happens legally, the only way to get it is through the underground, I think just speaks to the salience that these types of activists play and will continue to play. So again, I sort of recognize that's a cop out because I honestly don't know what's going to happen with politics in the courts, but I think the point is that that actually might matter less. And that is something that's interesting to think about.
Well, thank you for your work, and you know, I can't recommend the book enough. It is really well done, and sometimes difficult to read, but that's because of because of the frustrations
But
activists.
sometimes fun too, right?
Absolutely fun, yes.
There's boats, there's
Both.
sparkle.
But yeah, it's really well done. So congratulations.
Thank you so much.
Hang on one second.